Welcome to the EPG Pathshala's Linguistics course, specifically to the Morphology and Syntax paper for which I am responsible. My name is Prabal Dasgupta. I teach at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata. In this module, which is called Interactive Subjects and Objects, we are going to look at constructions called control constructions involving an upstairs position, a position in the matrix sentence, controlling the deletion of some element downstairs, where that deletion takes place either in a subject position or in an object position, hence the term interactive subjects and objects. We begin by considering those cases of controlled deletion which sort of, approximately correspond to cases of raising that we studied in the preceding module, the module about mobile subjects and objects. So we want you to compare the sentences, Ram seemed to be cheerful with raising, and Ram tried to be cheerful, which does not have raising. In the raising construction, Ram seemed to be cheerful. You've already learned that Ram was in the downstairs subject position. It was the subject of to be cheerful. And it has been raised from there to the upstairs subject position, that of seemed. If Ram had not been raised, you would be stuck with the deep structure. Delta seemed Ram to be cheerful, which had the same overall properties as the finite counterpart sentence. It seemed that Ram was cheerful. In contrast, the sentence, Ram tried to be cheerful, begins its career with Ram accepted as the deep structure subject of tried. The paraphrase is not, it tried that John was cheerful. It tried that Ram was cheerful. The paraphrase is something like, being cheerful was Ram's goal. Ram made an effort to attain that goal. In other words, Ram is the deep structure subject of be cheerful and the deep structure subject of tried, and the two deep structure subjects are co-referential. That is what we need to understand. In the context of trying to understand the fact that the upstairs subject controls the downstairs subject position, we have already introduced you to the basic notions of the horseshoe model. So you will not be surprised to hear that we claim the deep structure of Ram tried to be cheerful contains a volatile element, namely a volatile subject of the downstairs to be cheerful. In other words, the deep structure is Ram tried X he to be cheerful, where the volatile subject X he is co-referential to the overt upstairs subject Ram. We show the co-referentiality in our notation by attaching the same subscript letter I to Ram and to X he in the two subject positions. In this derivation, there is no movement at all. That is why this is not called a mobile subjects and objects module, but an interacting subjects and objects module. The volatile pronoun X he is exactly where it is supposed to be, and the rule of control will delete that element. Now that we have introduced these referential index letters like I and J, we have to immediately answer your query. You're bound to ask at once, where do these referential indices come from? We need a mechanical algorithm to generate these indices. In our system, the answer is, when a lexical head enters a syntactic tree, when a noun, verb, adjective, or preposition comes into a syntactic tree by lexical insertion, it is immediately assigned or issued a referential index which is unique to that element. It keeps that index throughout the derivation. That's as far as lexical heads are concerned. That is not all of the syntactic tree. The syntactic tree also contains grammatical items such as Q for quantifier or deg for degree or aux for auxiliary. What about those? The answer is those grammatical items share the index of the associated lexical head. Q or deg shares the index of the adjective or noun that it is associated with. An auxiliary or a negation shares the index of the verb it is associated with. What about pronouns? Pronouns are special because all pronouns, regardless of whether they are overt or volatile, are grammatical items inserted into a lexical position. We therefore have to propose a special dispensation for pronouns. We call it index licensing. In this module, module 19, we shall talk about how volatile pronouns get their index assignment licensed. In the following module, module 20, we are going to look at what exactly happens to overt pronouns by way of indexing and how the index gets handled. Now let us look at the case of volatile subject being deleted under identity with the upstairs subject, which is overt. Ram inducing the deletion of X he. What you need is a transformation that carries out this deletion. We shall call it subject controlled deletion. We will state it as shown in item 3 as a structural description that shows clearly what the indexing is like. It says NP index I followed by aux followed by a variable, and then there is a control trigger shown as carrying the feature plus control, which means it triggers this kind of control deletion, followed by another variable y. Then the downstairs sentence begins. We indicate this by drawing a left bracket and labeling it with S for sentence. And it begins with this X word. Notice that the X word, which is a volatile word, is co-indexed with the upstairs subject. That is why the upstairs subject is shown as NP subscript I, and this is shown as X word subscript I. All this is followed by the infinitival marker 2 and then another variable Z. That gives you 8 factors. Of the 8 factors, factor number 6, which is that special volatile X word, is deleted. So you end up with the structural change 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, 7, 8. There is no movement, there is no insertion, so you don't see a single plus in the structural change. Nothing is going anywhere else. 6 dies, 6 evaporates. And the evaporation happens under identity with factor number 1. Remember that the principle of recoverability of deletion forces every deletion rule either to be under identity with a copy or that of a designated element that you can guess from the context. This is a case of deletion under identity with a copy. How do you make sure that the input has been properly cooked for the eating that is going to take place in deletion under identity of the downstairs subject? What we mean by this question is, what are the mechanisms that are responsible for the upstairs subject and the downstairs volatile subject having the same index? Remember that indexing happens separately for each entity. Within a clause, indexing happens freely for each entity in the clause. Across clauses, because there is the random possibility of the matching of indices, you're getting this kind of matching. Why is the matching happening? What makes the matching possible? And what are you going to do if the matching doesn't happen? Suppose the downstairs volatile pronoun has an index j and the upstairs subject has an index I and the two don't match. The answer is, if you have a downstairs volatile pronoun with the index j that doesn't match the upstairs overt subject with the index I, the transformation, as you see, does not apply. Because the transformation doesn't apply and because you have a volatile element which will have no occasion to get deleted in the rest of the derivation, at the surface structure, the volatile element X he index j is going to survive undeleted. If that happens, you have a disaster on your hands, because surface structures are not supposed to contain volatile elements. Every volatile element is marked as requiring demolition. If that required demolition has not taken place, you have a crisis. How does syntax solve the crisis? This is not a problem merely for these controlled deletion cases. It is a general problem for the entire theory, and of course the problem was noticed instantly in the 1960s when this whole apparatus was set up. And at the same time as it was noticed, people had come up with a solution. That solution was given to us in the same book as the standard theory. So it's a very, very old solution. It's 50 years old. That solution is briefly called filtering. Filtering is a difficult topic. You will learn about it gradually over the next few lessons, but you're beginning the learning right now. If the grammar sees a volatile element sitting there in a surface structure, it says bad surface structure, bad derivation, throw it out. That is what the grammar does. Now you are slowly going to get an unpacking of what is meant by this simple sounding statement that the grammar throws away a derivation if it sees an unwanted element in the surface structure. The claim being made by the grammar that throws out structure 5, Ram subscript I tried he subscript j to be cheerful, where he is volatile, x he. The grammar, by making that rejection, is making the claim that if I say Ram tried to be cheerful, I do not mean Ram made an effort for somebody else to be cheerful. Imagine a world in which I could say Ram tried to be cheerful, and in which what I said would be ambiguous between Ram made an effort for Ram to be cheerful, meaning 1, and Ram made an effort for somebody else to be cheerful, meaning 2. In such a world, you would want the system not to throw out a derivation in which the downstairs volatile subject happens to have a different index from Ram, because you want the prediction that such sentences are okay, they come to the surface, they have exactly the meaning you expect. In the world in which we live, Ram tried to be cheerful is a statement about Ram and nobody else. Nobody else's cheerfulness is under discussion. Therefore, if the grammar tries to give you a reading for this sentence where Ram and the cheerful person are different, you have to throw it out. So the grammar, by insisting on the index matching, is making it possible to make the prediction that you want it to make. That is why the filtering function of the grammar is extremely important. It is part of the empirical interface. It is part of where the linguistic theory faces the facts of the world. You want the theory to capture the facts correctly and accurately. Therefore, in this case, you want the derivation leading to surface structure 5 to crash. You want it to fail. So far, we have talked about what corresponds to raising to subject. We have talked about an interactive matrix subject. Let us now talk about interactive matrix objects, an object in the upstairs sentence that interacts with stuff downstairs. An example of an interactive matrix object is Nita persuaded Nalini to leave. In that surface structure, you can see that in Nita persuaded Nalini to leave, the leaving is going to be done not by Nita but by Nalini. So it is the object of persuade, not the subject of persuade, that controls deletion of the downstairs volatile subject, she. So the deep structure for Nita persuaded Nalini to leave is roughly Nita persuaded Nalini subscript I, downstairs sentence, subject, X, she subscript I to leave. And then you have to make sure that the volatile she downstairs gets deleted. How do you do it? You set up a rule called object control deletion, which looks like this. Variable, auxiliary, variable, control trigger, such as persuade, followed by the object NP, factor 5 already. Then you open the downstairs sentence and look at its subject, you say X word, volatile word, subscript I, identical to the upstairs NP, followed by 2, followed by Z. You've got 8 factors this time. And of these 8 factors, surprise, surprise, you want factor number 6 to die. That's all that you want. So your output is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, 7, 8 instead of 5, 6, 7, 8. This is not all there is to say about controlled deletion. So far we have stuck very closely to raising. We have looked at parallels to raising. Indeed, many control constructions are nearly carbon copies of raising constructions. However, control is a much bigger phenomenon than raising. There are construction types where controlled deletion happens, to which there is no counterpart in the grammar of raising. So the following section of our module deals with those extra constructions in which there is control, to which there is no raising counterpart at all. The first example is participles. When you take a sentence like, all students taking notes face this problem, you find 2 verbs here, an upstairs verb, which is in the finite form, it has present tense, face. The subject of that verb is all students. Another verb appears downstairs in this embedded clause, which is in the participle form, taking, as in taking notes. The subject of taking and the subject of face are really the same, all students. But you're saying all students only once. And given the fact that face, the matrix verb, which is finite, which carries present tense, is in the plural form and evidently agrees with the subject of the matrix verb, all students. All students can only do the job of being the subject of face. It cannot simultaneously be the subject of taking notes. No grammatical theory anywhere in the world permits one subject to serve 2 verbs at the same time. Can't be done. You're either the upstairs subject or the downstairs subject. So, for the downstairs subject, you evidently have to postulate a second subject, a volatile they, and you have to then delete it under identity with all students. So your deep structure is all students, subscript I, downstairs sentence, subject X they, subscript I, taking notes, end of downstairs sentence, then you go back upstairs, face this problem. That is the deep structure you're dealing with. In order to get from that to the surface structure, you need to delete the subject of the participle. So let us call the rule controlled deletion of subject of participle, which we state as, in terms of 5 factors, variable, noun phrase with the subscript I. Then you open your participle. In the participle you have an X word with the same subscript I. And evidently you need a participle out there. And then you have a variable covering things quite generally. Within the variable is embedded the final, the right bracket that closes the participial phrase. It doesn't matter where you close it, so it's somewhere inside the Y. In our statements, we deliberately leave out the right brackets if there is a variable, because a variable covers anything. It also covers a right bracket. Some authors don't do it this way. We want to warn you about this. So you got these 5 factors, of which the third factor, the volatile word downstairs, is the one that gets deleted. This is what happens in participles. We work out for you something parallel to the participle, namely the gerund construction, which is a type of subordinate clause where the verb in the clause ends in ing. So you get consuming alcohol can be dangerous. Now what goes on in gerunds is slightly different from what goes on in from what goes on in infinitivals, although there are many similarities. Consuming alcohol can be dangerous is very similar to consume alcohol can be dangerous. However, there are some differences. An important difference concerns the control facts. You can say Sarah considered taking a day off. Julie is skeptical about launching a boutique. Now, in Sarah considered taking a day off, it is quite clear that you mean Sarah considered the option that Sarah might take a day off. She is not considering the takeoff, the leave of anybody else. Whereas in the case of Julie is skeptical about launching a boutique, there is ambiguity because Julie can be skeptical about herself, Julie launching a boutique, or she can be skeptical about anybody launching a boutique. Now, there is a difference between the properties of the gerund construction. They allow this kind of arbitrary reference, a reference to anybody at all, in the subject position of the gerund, in the kind of place where infinitives don't allow it. You will, for example, get a sentence like, the police have decided to stop drinking after midnight. This is ambiguous between the police have decided that the police will no longer drink after midnight, or the other meaning, the police have decided that if they see anybody else drinking after midnight, they will stop them. Now, you can't do this with infinitives. If you have an infinitival such as, the police have decided to cease to drink after midnight. Cease happens to be a matrix verb that chooses infinitives downstairs. It turns out that the police have decided to cease to drink after midnight can only mean that the police have decided that they, the police, will no longer drink after midnight. It cannot have the other meaning where the downstairs sentence has an arbitrary subject. Whereas gerunds permit this, unlike infinitives. This is a mysterious difference between gerunds and infinitives. By mysterious, I mean the best scholars in linguistics don't yet understand it. For the time being, let us ask you to look at the e-text for this module and to look at the final passage in section 2, in which we ask you to scrutinize very carefully the distribution of nominative and accusative case-marked forms, and to notice that there is something connected to case going on in these examples, and that if you think about it, you will find case a sufficient factor to rule out a sentence of this type. Now we turn to interacting subjects and objects dealing with a downstairs object. We turn to the construction that corresponds to tough movement in the case of mobile subjects and objects. That construction is known as the complement object deletion construction because that is the rule that applies. It turns the sentence Jill is pretty to look at her into Jill is pretty to look at. We assume that the underlying or deep structure is Jill is pretty to look at X her, where X her is co-referential with Jill, and that you come out with the surface structure Jill is pretty to look at. How do you know that Jill is pretty to look at is not simply an example of tough movement? How do you know that Jill is pretty to look at isn't exactly like John is easy to please? The answer is John is easy to please is synonymous with it is easy to please John. Whereas Jill is pretty to look at is not synonymous with it is pretty to look at Jill. You cannot say it is pretty to look at Jill. Looking at Jill is pretty. That's not possible. So clearly in Jill is pretty to look at, you have two occurrences of Jill. There's an upstairs occurrence which survives and a downstairs occurrence which does not survive. That is why you know that you have complement object deletion. Please notice a point of terminology here. The process is called the transformation of complement object deletion because you are deleting the object of a complement clause. So complement object is an abbreviation for complement clause object. What is a complement clause? A complement clause is a subordinate clause which plays the role of the complement to some matrix head next to which it is embedded. In this case, in Jill is pretty to look at, the clause is to look at. It is in the infinitival form, and this clause serves as complement to the adjective pretty which is the head of the adjective phrase. The adjective phrase is a construction involving the head, the adjective pretty, and a dependent, which in particular is a complement type of dependent. We are saying these things to stitch together what you learned very slowly in the relatively early syntax lessons, and that which you are now being forced to learn somewhat rapidly in the middle lessons. We know that some of you will find the pace upsetting, but as you keep looking at the material and, if necessary, going over it again and again and moving back and forth between the earlier lessons and the later lessons, we promise you that comprehension will dawn, because the entire structure is logical and holds together. You will find that there is no difficulty in moving between lessons and in putting the material together as you slowly crack the nuts one by one. It is going to be possible. Please don't lose heart. I know that some of you are losing heart. In the e-text, we also consider some Indian language data which is analogous, for which we do not offer any analysis because the better syntacticians who do careful research and publish their research in these journals and books have not come out with an analysis, and we are not in a position to improve on their lack of understanding. So we just want you to look at the data and form your own judgment of the kinds of data available in Indian languages. There is no point in our rehearsing in the oral exposition in its entirety the whole discussion of the Bangla data given in the concluding paragraphs of the e-text for this module. Instead of that, we would like to, by way of summary, point out that the study of controlled deletion operations, to which this module has been devoted, parallels to a great extent the study of raising constructions that was the subject matter of the preceding module. However, there is an important difference. There are many constructions, such as participles, such as gerunds, such as those obligatory control constructions with embedded interrogatives that we showed you in an exercise. These have absolutely no counterpart in the grammar of raising to subject or raising to object. In the other direction, there are phenomena in the domain of raising for which you will find no counterpart in the domain of control. For example, there is restricted raising. We don't know of any restricted control construction. So there is a huge overlap between raising and control, but it's not total in either direction. However, the surplus control constructions cover a much bigger range than the surplus raising constructions. That is more or less the long and short of the overlap and non-overlap between raising and control. As a rule of thumb, you will find raising relatively easy to understand if you keep comparing it with control and vice versa. But you have to watch out and you have to prevent this from becoming the key to all the understanding you have of raising and control, because control has distinctive properties of its own that cannot be reduced to raising. So when you study the whole domain, you will be well advised to distinguish the study of control from that of raising and not to mix the two up by claiming that they're entirely parallel to each other. They're not entirely parallel to each other. There are important differences, not only of the kinds that we have discussed in this elementary morphology and syntax course with you. When you get into advanced syntax, you will find additional reasons for making a very sharp distinction between raising and control. So this module has been devoted to the study of controlled deletion, and we began to look at what happens when the necessary matching of referential indices does not take place. In order to talk about these, we gave you a very quick story about how referential indices are introduced into the tree in the first place. That story may prove to be unsustainable, but for the purposes of this course, we are happy to assure you we will stick to that story throughout. We are not going to modify it at any stage. This module has also added to your understanding of the filtering out business, where certain derivations are thrown out. because they have unwanted material at the surface structure level. We have given you empirical reasons for keeping that device in the grammatical architecture. So as you can see, this module has been working on several fronts. It has been pulling the threads from the earlier modules in 4 or 5 distinct domains, and it has brought them together into a single package that forms an expository whole, but you need to also keep following the threads separately. So when you go back to the e-text to study it after having listened to this oral exposition, we predict that you will find yourself making a lot of notes and trying to tease the strands apart as you make the necessary distinctions between the kinds of topics that are discussed and the way that they interact with each other. In other words, in this module of interacting subjects and objects, there is also a lot of interaction among the topics discussed here. And we warn you that you have to tease the strands apart and follow each topic separately in order to not lose track of what is going on. We remind you at the end of this oral exposition that it is always important to keep watching out for supplementary readings and to keep doing your reading and not lose track of the necessary balance between listening and reading. We end by asking you again for any questions or criticism that you might have. Thank you for your attention.